This is the last video in a series where I show you how I carved a raccoon holding a replica wooden boombox that's also a Bluetooth player. So to start this build, I needed enough material to make a hollow box, and I happen to have this old headboard someone gave me years ago laying around the shop. I could clean up the top edge because the bottom at one point it looked like I was going to cut a whale out of it or something, was pretty jagged. So I could just clean that up with the circular saw, and then I could send it to the table saw and start putting my 45s on the edges because I wanted my corners mitered so you didn't see end grain, even though eventually I would be fixing those. You'll see later in the video I changed them a little bit. This material was 3/4 of an inch, and I made a rookie mistake by assuming it was flat and all the same thickness. It was not. So when I went to go cut my 45s on the miter saw, they were a little off. I was able to fix it enough on my crosscut sled to get it to work, but you'll notice when I glue it up there are some gaps. This is not going to affect my design because I knew at this point I was going to be adding a different colored chamfer on all the edges of the piece, but I wanted to point that out because you will see in the video there are some gaps in that miter. The shape of this was pretty much dictated by the opening between the raccoon's arms, which is a little shy of 10 inches, and then the thickness was kind of based on the instructions of the Bluetooth radio and also to keep it within a reasonable scale. And then the height, once again, just made it kind of look like a longer rectangular box that matched a boom box. I think it was about 6 inches tall. So I found an image online that had enough detail that I thought would work with what I was going with, but not too much because this is going in my shop. It's not for a customer, so I didn't have a bunch of time to work on it. The first thing I wanted to do in order of operations on projects like this can get a little murky, but the first thing I wanted to do was add some grooving on both edges because a lot of electronics have that. I'm assuming they're for grip, and they're very distinctive, especially to older electronics, and I wanted to do that before I did anything else because I couldn't cut them when I added other things to it. I used my finger jointing jig on the table saw to do that. It turned out pretty cleanly. Then the big part I wanted to get was a little cassette tape that went inside of the boombox, and I used the laser engraver quite a bit on this in order to save time. I found a file online that I was able to modify and cut out a cassette tape, and then all I had to do was take that cassette tape and route out. So I used a Forstner bit in order to remove that material, and then a chisel to remove the rest. At this point, I went and I cut all the openings for the actual Bluetooth player, which I got from Rockler. It's 2 speakers and then a dial system that goes up top. Now the openings for these are such odd sizes. I've used these kits before and they work really well, but you need like a 2 7/8 hole saw and then a 1 5/8 for the 2 openings, which I didn't have. So I drilled them as close to the size as possible, and then I just went through with my die grinder and removed enough material to get all the speakers in the top to fit. I kind of went to sleep that night with the cassette player and a plan in my head, and by the next morning I decided it would be much cooler if I can make the door actually open and close. Originally I was just going to have a false front on it and the cassette tape would permanently be in the player. So I kind of played around with some designs. I knew I needed an arched arm in order for the door to open the way I wanted it to, just like on regular boom boxes. So I scrapped this out before what you're seeing here, and I got a rough shape. I got it to work, and then I made final pieces very simply by just drilling a couple shallow mortises through the whole box. The height of that was kind of arbitrary. I don't have an exact height. And then I have those 2 arms. This is about 1/8 inch ply that fit on the sides. I can then cut a front and arch out the front so that it would wrap around the cassette tape. You could still see what it said. And then I just super glued those pieces together. For the carriage that holds the cassette, once again, just 2 little pieces of material. So now the cassette can sit in place and the arms will go in and out of the player. And this was the basic setup I had for the cassette. I was happy I did this. It looks really cool, but stuff like this with troubleshooting, like I said, you didn't see the first models I went through in order to get that, can take a long time. And then for the front of this, all I did was take some tracing paper and kind of map out the shape I wanted based on the front. And then I could cut that out and just spray adhesive it to the scrap I have. The scrap I'm using for this is actually pallet wood scrap that I already have planed down from a project I did in the shop a couple months ago. So it's pretty, I could cut it into thin sheets, so it's about 1/16, 1/8 of an inch material, nice and thin, low profile. I could cut out that front opening with a coping saw, and then everything gets chamfered to kind of match the way the electronics look. I have some very thin sheet plexiglass in the shop. I could glue to the back side of that, and then in order to attach this, I just glued the front of the frame I made to the front of the carriage that holds the cassette. I let it dry out of the piece so it didn't get stuck, and then that was how I did the cassette player. So like I said, I mitered this together so there's no end grain, but I knew I wanted a chamfered edge around the whole box, which is pretty similar, like I keep saying, to traditional boom boxes. So what I decided to do was put a rabbit groove around the entire front perimeter of the box and the entire back perimeter of the box. And then I was going to put a very low angled profiled piece that's a similar enough color to the wood I'm working with, which is a lightish brown, on the edges so that it would pop a little bit but not stick out too much. I happen to have some low profile angles from a project I did a few years ago made out of mahogany laying around the shop. I was able to trim them down just enough so I could glue them around the frame and sand them flush, so it worked out perfectly. I made pretty much all of this with scrap I already had. So I could take that mahogany, trim it down. It's just a little angle I'm left with, just a minor detail that really kind of sets off the edge. I can miter those corners as well and join them all together with glue. With stuff like this where the miters are a little bit tough because you're working with an angled piece and cutting an angle, I like to have both angles set up and I glue one piece at a time so that one edge is, you see, glued in place, and then I just work my way around the box cutting my angles so they all get on there perfectly. To attach these, I obviously use glue, but also my pin nailer so you wouldn't see any of the nail holes, and then let all of that dry. So then once I did the back side, I could, like I said, it's mahogany, it sands and finishes really well, so I could just sand it down flush with the sides and the top, and then that is how I got that detail on the edge, and you could see why it was really important I cut the fins before I did that part. So then for the dial indicator on the front, I once again found a file on Etsy. These files are usually only $1 or $2. It was something I didn't feel like carving. Like I said, time was of the essence. I found one that I wasn't in love with but would work for this, and I just cut it out to my specs. And then as you can see, that front of the piece I'm using is a different piece of lumber. So I actually wanted to have this recessed, just like in the photo I'm working off of, and a different piece of lumber. So very similar to how I did the cassette, I'm going to make a groove so that it's recessed, and then I'm going to drill out material into that groove so the parts I made and the plexi on top of it can fit into that shallow mortise, and then I can cover it with that frame. And for the frame, I'm going to use the same material. It's all that white or poplar, and those are going to be the accent pieces for the boombox. So you can see I have my recessed rabbit essentially at the top at this point. I'm just using a spade bit to groove all of that out, remove the material quicker, and then a chisel to clean up to the edge. So then I could then pop the piece I had in there, and I can mark where it had to be cut out. Now, the laser's convenient, but I still haven't learned a program like Illustrator in order to draw my own things. So a workaround I have for that at this point is I draw everything on wood. I have a laser with a camera, which is a really nice feature for these lasers. I could go in the program and trace on top of my drawing, as long as it's a simple drawing, simple curves, simple squares, and cut it out that way. So that's how I did all that. Unfortunately, after I cut it is when I realized that the print that I had printed out, they had done it so it was different on both sizes. So the two verticals I had weren't lining up. I just decided to get rid of them, cut a full rectangle and put it on top, chamfer the edges, chamfer the inside once again, and the plexiglass is flush with the front, you can see, and then I could glue my frame right on top of it, and that is how I did the dial indicator and super glued that all in place. And then once I have everything glued in place, it's easier to chamfer those pieces once they're already set in. Next was a handle. All boom boxes are going to have a handle. It was definitely something I wanted on there, so I decided to make it an inset handle. I like the way those look a little bit better. Unfortunately, at this point, I wasn't paying attention, which happens in the shop, and I cut a little too far forward of where I wanted it to be. I wanted there to be a little bit of a space in the front, and I just had to work with this. So I had some sapele from some doors that I made a few years ago laying around. They were actually, I cut that groove on the side to match the size of the sapele. I put a very, very simple curve on the front, and that curve will make it so the handlebar can move up and down. I spaced it out with some pennies, drilled a hole on the drill press so it was nice and square, and then with the drill press hole I could transfer that hole into the boombox. Just use 1/4 inch dowels, and then that is how the handle lifts up and down. Pretty simple. To kind of span those two handles, once again, scrap piece of sapele that I had that already had a slight angle cut into it, which added a nice little design element to the top. So I have my two handles in place. I can mark how wide that has to be, cut it down, and then same process. I drilled 2 holes on the drill press, and then I could have that clamped in place and drill through the top side of the handle holes into the handlebar and attach it once again with 1/4 inch dowels. And that's how I did the top side handle, kind of keeping a lot of the accessories in the same color family. So I wanted basically just the inserts with the electronic parts to stick out. The rest of it, I wanted it to be a different color, but not too much. And then when I lift the handle, it looked really stupid. I was kind of rushing. This was the end of the day on a Friday. So the next day I came in, it was just too tall. And what I did was I added some maple on the side so it matched the front, and that would allow me to shorten the handles, but not enough. So what I did was I routed a groove on the back of the boombox so the handle could be even shorter, and a lot of them have this design anywhere where the handle sets into the entire top side of the frame. So that was a quick workaround to the fact that the handle I made the first time was just way too tall. At this point, it's the same process. I'm just re-drilling the sides, and then once I did that, this isn't glued together yet. I glued together everything. Obviously not the dowel that's going to pivot. That one stays unglued, but I was much happier with the shorter profile of that handle. For the dial indicator, which I learned are called graphic equalizers that you see a lot on these electronics, it was the same problem. JPEGs don't cut really well on the laser, but I was able to import an image I really like, and because it was straight lines and squares, I just drew on top of it in the program, and that is how I was able to cut it out. The nice thing about that is you could remove rectangles and add rectangles, so I could delete some of my information and then also cut out the exact same size and plexi to go on top of it. And that was how I did the graphic equalizer. Same thing, the wooden part's going to be recessed, and then it's going to have a low profile top piece that's made out of poplar. I painted the inside of the cassette player and the inside of the graphic equalizer part black so that you didn't see wood behind it. But that is basically how that all fits in place. The frame I also cut out on the laser engraver. And then to make little dials, I just took some scrap sapele. I actually think this scrap was cut off from something I made earlier. Some scrap oak that I had. I glued the scrap oak to the little pieces of sapele, and then those are the knobs that I'm going to use for this. So those just kind of sit in wherever they want. At some point I do paint those black so that they stuck out a little bit more, but I don't think I filmed that. One of the last things I did on this before I finished was, even though the top is a dial for the Bluetooth player, I wanted there to be push buttons because that's kind of a hallmark of boomboxes. Same exact thing. I took measurements, simple squares, I drew it right in Lightburn, and then I was able to cut it out for the top. This one's not going to get insert, and then I still had some of that leftover mahogany, so I just trimmed it down in order to make the knobs. So this was pretty easy. It was really nice to use scrap. When you're cutting small parts like this, I always like to use a miter box. It's just the safest way to do it. And then I could just transfer the edges with some sandpaper and put those knobs in place. The finish on this is the same finish as the Raccoon. It's Osmo oil. I put on 2 coats for this, and at this point I could still add stuff to this. I had a couple concepts and ideals to finish this off more, but I didn't know if I wanted to get too crazy with over designing it, so I like the option of adding maybe some graphics and different components to it later. But in general, this is what it looks like. I can't play music on it because I'll get flagged for copyright, but I got the kit from Rockler. I've used it before for presents for other people, and I really like it. The BoomBox was the most enjoyable part of this build. It was a nice level of challenging, not too time consuming, and creative.